Thursday marked the 3-year anniversary of the White House press conference to announce 15 days to slow the spread, a premise that, of course, lasted dozens of times beyond its initial sales pitch and resulted in significant economic and social damage, the consequences of which we are still enduring today. And looking back, note just how weirdly cheery and casual it was at the time.
There's an answer to this.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Tony. He was my mentor, so I'm going to have to let him speak.
The small print here, it's really small print. In states with evidence of community transmission, bars, restaurants, food courts, gyms, and other indoor and outdoor venues where groups of people congregate should be closed.
The advocacy of life-altering or even ruinous policy was just something of a joke, as was their supposed commitment to the rights of the people, or the general lack thereof. It seems so obvious in retrospect that they were not serious in the first place, but the fear with which people viewed this at the time has the effect of making even the most silly premise seem perfectly credible, because after all, these were the experts, and you were just a rube. And even though those at this press conference were not the policemen themselves, the threat of enforcement has that same effect too. Many will readily submit to the silly if the alternative is state harassment to arrest or fine them out of business. Of course, different parts of the country handled that threat and enforcement differently, rightfully so, but nobody was as early and aggressive as California's Bay Area. It was the same night after that press conference, March 16th, 2020, that initially 6 and then 7 Bay Area counties announced a new lockdown policy together. Sit down, shut up, close everything, or we're coming after you if you don't. The Bay Area was the most aggressive in the country, and Santa Clara County, San Jose, was the most aggressive in the Bay. Santa Clara County established a snitch line to encourage neighbors to turn on neighbors, and of course, to handle what the snitches didn't, Santa Clara County built a squad of compliance enforcement officers, paying them handsome wages to ensure that the citizenry was handicapped in earning its own. It was one of the very few new jobs you could get at the time. Become a hired thug in the health department's business compliance unit and earn over $200 an hour to abuse your fellow citizens. And amazingly, this particular government program actually was highly productive. In a completely contradictory, destructive way, of course, but the county's goon squad certainly did provide their money's worth of harassment. By March the next year, 2021, the county had issued nearly $5 million in fines to nearly 400 businesses and other organizations for pandemic rules infractions. To compare, the neighboring Bay Area counties, certainly not slouches in terms of ideological commitment to the cause, collected only a combined $82,000 in fines and penalties. And while much of the country is moving on, or already did long ago, Santa Clara County remains committed to the continued harassment. Despite the Supreme Court deciding in February 2021, more than 2 years ago, that the state of California was particularly restrictive, hostile, and discriminatory in its treatment of churches, and therefore the gathering ban at churches was struck down as unconstitutional, Santa Clara County is still pursuing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against one San Jose church for the high crime of repeated unmasked hugging. And that is not an exaggeration. The Supreme Court said nothing about the constitutionality of mask or social distancing rules or their corresponding punishment, and so the case continues. And it's through this lengthy court battle that we now have a view into the preposterously extensive government record-keeping effort to document this recklessness, a rebellious commitment to unmasked hugging in defiance of state orders otherwise. Reporter David Zweig has chronicled the story on his Substack, the details published earlier this month under the title, "When a Renegade Church and a Zealous County Health Department Collide," the subheading notes the church became the target of an unprecedented surveillance operation, and he has the documents to prove it. This was not your typical knock on the door, deliver a citation type enforcement. This was a spy op treating a church like it was bin Laden's compound. In March 2020, the county issued the lockdown order, and San Jose Calvary Chapel, under the leadership of Pastor Mike McClure, initially complied. They complied for over 2 months, in fact, closing the church until late May, when they decided that's enough on both principle and necessity, McClure announced the church would reopen. And for good reason. Beyond just their rights to, members of this church, speaking with this reporter, describe varying situations of desperation, breakups, losing jobs, alcoholism, all the serious consequences of the social separation we imposed, helped by the social belonging and purpose that the church can and did provide. So the church reopened. One member quoted in the story credits the church for literally saving her son's life, and of course, because it was one of only a few institutions willing to stand for itself, for its members, and for God over government, Calvary Chapel actually grew significantly, with many new members finding a home there, expanding church attendance to previously unreached heights, as we now know from the government spy op monitoring all of it. On August 23rd, Santa Clara County Business Compliance Unit officers began their enforcement against the church. They visited, observed congregants, and issued a citation for masking, gathering, singing, and dancing violations. Yes, it came full circle. Now it was the church ladies getting busted for inappropriate dancing, and like true rebels, these church ladies apparently gave the officers something of a GTFO in response. Perhaps it was more Christ-like, or perhaps not, but from that day forward, at least for a few months, these enforcement officers were prohibited from Calvary Chapel premises. But of course, instead of following the rules imposed against them, these enforcement officers just did exactly what they otherwise enforce against. They bent the rules. They found workarounds to do what they wanted to do anyway, the very sort of behavior they were otherwise punishing. But I suppose in their defense, they did become exactly the petty tyrants they were paid to be. So hopefully it was satisfying to collect such a big paycheck to make sure that their neighbors had a tougher time collecting theirs. And speaking of that neighborly betrayal, that is exactly where the petty tyrants went next, to find the good little neighbors who would eagerly help the government thugs. And the enforcement agents quite literally became the ATF meme, spying on the church by peeping over or through a neighboring fence. Though at least this time they never engaged in the Waco-style arson tactics, but still, these enforcement agents did engage in some tactical escalation. The Business Enforcement Unit reached a deal with a law-abiding church next door and set up shop there to surveil Calvary Chapel every Sunday through a chain-link fence separating the properties. Enforcement officers typically worked in pairs, compiling reports on this weekly basis, describing the nature of the violations they observed in absurd detail. One officer wrote in his diary, "Today we watched through the fence as greeters welcomed attendees into the building. Those entering were not wearing face coverings. None of the greeters were wearing face coverings either," despite the fact that those observed engaging in this violative behavior were outside. And unless I'm mistaken, there was no outdoor mask mandate at the time, or ever. Doesn't matter though, because the social distancing order was violated too. According to their writings, these officers witnessed rebel hugging, physical touch in violation of state order. What's particularly creepy about this stakeout is in no way was it necessary to document any of these supposed violations. Anyway, Calvary Chapel wasn't pretending otherwise. They were openly inviting people into their facility and openly live streaming their indoor in-person events on YouTube. But apparently, there might have been some sort of creepy enjoyment factor that these officers got out of the experience. The fence spying continued until November, when the county secured a court order to allow them back on church property. The enforcement officers then had the legal ability to visit the church and inspect the events inside, but in at least some contexts, they instead chose to keep their monitoring at a distance, to be less intrusive, they say. On November 3rd, officers described observing a Manna for Moms event, a mom prayer group, including children. The officers' timing was not happenstance either. They described wanting to spy on this event in particular, but they didn't want to be intrusive, so they chose to watch the event through a window instead. Officers documented there were 17 women present, 1 infant and 2 children, some not maintaining proper social distancing, some not masked, and at least 1 woman illegally singing indoors. So now they're not just the ATF guy peeking over the fence, now they're teetering on Herbert the Pervert territory too. But as suspiciously creepy as all of these tactics were, they were still unsophisticated. This is Silicon Valley, after all, the world's capital for tech innovation. Of course, with a big budget and technological resources, Santa Clara County wasn't going to just stop with this bizarre peep show of moms hugging at their prayer group. This was a modern-day spy op, too. And so Santa Clara County turned to the neighboring Stanford University Law School to hire a professor to build a research team to monitor and analyze cell phone data to track visits at the church as well. Working through a company called SafeGraph, which harvests the location data our phones submit through various apps, this professor and his team used a geofence to define the border around the church facility and observe visitation data in combination with statistical modeling to fill in the gaps to create an estimate of how many people were visiting this church. The professor estimated a peak of about 670 visits a day pre-COVID, exploding to 1,700 people a day in early 2021. Again, a point of fact that the church made no effort to hide. It didn't take a government spy op and a pile of public money paid to some professor to gather information that the church's pastor willingly provided for free. This reporter asked the pastor if the numbers the professor provided are accurate. Pastor McClure openly states, "Yeah, that sounds about right. Our numbers exploded because we were one of only a few churches in town actually willing to continue operation." One answer was free and took about 5 minutes to acquire. The other answer cost $800 per hour. This has been a lesson in government efficiency. But in addition to being completely unnecessary, at least in this context, these data harvesting tactics are something of a Fourth Amendment frontier, too, an unsettled area in a legal Wild West. To get the data off of your phone in particular, the Fourth Amendment requires the government to get a warrant to search it. But to get the location data you submit potentially unknowingly to tech companies, well, in that case, the government only needs $1. In that context, they aren't government raiders. They're just data clients. And these government data clients are looking for trends in people's movements just like the advertisers are, except they're not looking for your dollar. They're looking for your compliance. So the government may want to see how many people are visiting a gun range, or they may want to see how many people are visiting an abortion clinic, or in this context, they may want to see how many people are shutting up, staying home, and keeping out of church. And of course, the government use of this monitoring will be targeted in its enforcement. The government will pick and choose whose compliance is prioritized. And so in this case, it is completely unsurprising to see that Santa Clara County did not care about traffic and gathering at shopping malls. They only cared about it at churches. That is part of the reason the state's similar approach was struck down by the Supreme Court. Technically speaking, the data are anonymized. The data company doesn't tell the government who each individual data point is, but as the government demonstrated throughout this story, there's the technicality and then there's the workaround. If the government wants to know which dot you are without a warrant, well, they need only identify the dot that travels to a location known to be unique to you, your home, for example, the address for which also does not require a warrant to acquire. It's unclear if Santa Clara County actually cracked that data anonymization to target individual churchgoers or not, or if that actually was the one area in which they showed some restraint, but the county continues to target the church as an organization today. The county is suing the church in state court to collect its $2.8 million in $5,000 daily fines over a year and a half's time. The church is suing the county in federal court alleging constitutional violations. Decisions in both cases could come soon, though, of course, a finding of a constitutional violation in federal court would invalidate the fine contested in state court. For the rest of us, this isn't a story with a technical legal lesson, though. This is a story with a crucial, general, philosophical one. You do not snitch and submit and tax your way to prosperity. You build it yourself, and that's why defending your rights to do that, and your neighbors too, is so crucially important. One approach is inherently constructive. The other is inherently destructive. And if we can't buy that in theory, we are running out of time to buy it in practice. So just take comfort in knowing that what dwindling wealth you do have will be taxed to take still more from your neighbors who likewise have less and less on the daily. That is the apparent mentality, with a critical mass of us somehow still convinced that approach eventually leads to prosperity despite every descending step. It does not. The actual path upward is exactly the one this church took on instinct: submission to God and a middle finger to the state. Experiment with the reverse at your own peril. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Minds. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.